It was April 1955 when then Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru stood in a hall at the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, echoing a new idea, along with delegates from Asian and African leaders, that the formerly colonized world could speak in its own voice and refuse the hegemony of empires. 71 years later, his successor, Narendra Modi, stood in the Israeli Knesset, accepting a medal that no foreign leader had ever received before, and ended his speech with these words:
Israel is their fatherland, and India, their motherland.
Between these two historic moments lies the drastic story of how India's foreign policy changed. In November 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into two states. 33 countries voted in favour, 13 voted against. India was one of the 13. Just months earlier, India had co-authored a minority plan with Iran and Yugoslavia, proposing a single federal Arab and Jewish state in Palestine. With the two groups sharing institutions, the plan failed. But India, a country newly free and independent from the British Empire, refused to endorse partition in Palestine. In doing so, it refused the divisive mentality imposed by its former masters, and imagined a world without colonization instead. 8 years later, in 1955, in the Indonesian city of Bandung, the leaders of 29 African and Asian states gathered for what numerous historians described as the political birth of the Global South. In an intervention before the conference's political committee, Nehru made what would become the founding argument for non-alignment.
Even the two great power blocks together cannot conquer India, not even the atom or the hydrogen bomb. I know what my people are, but I know also that if we rely on others, whatever great powers they might be, if we look to them for sustenance, then we are weak indeed.
6 years after Bandung, the non-aligned movement was formally pioneered in Belgrade by India, Yugoslavia, Egypt, Indonesia, and Ghana. By the 1970s, it consisted of more than 100 member states. On paper, it was the largest diplomatic bloc the world had ever seen. It also gave India something larger than moral standing, a room to move between rival power centres without formally belonging to either side. And in Palestine, India's position was steady. In January 1974, India became the first non-Arab country to formally recognize the Palestine Liberation Organization as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The same year, the PLO opened an office in New Delhi. By 1980, that office was a full embassy. India's foreign policy in those years extended the same logic of self-determination to Palestine that it had once claimed for itself. New Delhi's realignment with Tel Aviv did not begin with Narendra Modi. The Cold War order that had shaped Indian foreign policy was collapsing, China was rising, and Washington was consolidating power. To India, non-alignment increasingly began to look less like leverage and more like a limitation. In January 1992, India and Israel formalized diplomatic relations. The two countries had been quietly cooperating on intelligence and arms for years before finally making their relationship public. Then came Kargil. In the summer of 1999, India and Pakistan fought a high-altitude war in the Himalayas. Kargil accelerated India's relationship with Israel, one that soon expanded beyond weapons into surveillance, intelligence, cooperation, border infrastructure, and counter-terrorism doctrine. By the late 2000s, Israel had become India's second-largest defense supplier after Russia. India's military and intelligence services were buying Israeli technology at industrial scale. Despite its growing relationship with Tel Aviv, New Delhi continued to voice its support for the Palestinians. When Modi came to power, however, the relationship with Israel found the biggest staging ground, at the cost of India's decades-long Palestinian ally.
What a great day.
On July 4, 2017, Modi flew to Tel Aviv, becoming the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Israel without visiting Palestine. While the partnership itself was not new, what changed under Modi was that a relationship once managed quietly was now being brought to the centre of India's diplomatic identity. As the relationship became more public under Modi, support for Tel Aviv also spread across sections of India's Hindu nationalist movement, where Israel was increasingly portrayed as a model of hardline nationalism, one that shared anti-Islam fervour and was succeeding in oppressing Muslims, framing them as a demographic and security threat. He did not visit the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah during the trip, breaking with a decades-old Indian convention. During that visit, Israel and India signed agreements worth roughly $2 billion in arms and intelligence cooperation. Among the items India purchased, the Israeli NSO group's Pegasus spyware. The New York Times would later report that Pegasus was a centerpiece of the package. 3 days after Modi returned from Israel, ex-financier and convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein sent an email to an unidentified individual referred to as Jabor Y, saying that the Indian Prime Minister had taken his advice and danced and sang in Israel for the benefit of the US President. India's Foreign Ministry dismissed the email. In January 2023, Indian billionaire Gautam Adani, whose business empire had expanded rapidly under the Modi government, acquired a 70% stake in Israel's Haifa port for $1.18 billion.
Never on a foreign land where I felt so inspired. Never on a foreign land that I have admired as much as this land.
Modi flew to Israel for a second time as Prime Minister.
In 2026,
He became the first Indian leader to address the Knesset as lawmakers queued for selfies. He was given a medal, the Speaker of the Knesset Medal, created for the occasion. No foreign leader had ever received it before. The day before he landed, Netanyahu had announced something new. He called it the Hexagon Alliance and said it comprised India, Israel, Greece, Greek-administered Southern Cyprus, and unnamed Arab, African, and Asian partners. It increasingly placed India within a wider US-led security architecture, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indo-Pacific. After Israel launched its genocidal war on Palestine's Gaza in October 2023, India adopted a careful diplomatic tone. In December 2023, the United Nations General Assembly voted on a humanitarian ceasefire. 153 countries voted yes. India was among them. But New Delhi's voting record over the following months would be a story of inconsistency.
אבל לא בהודו. בהודו יש תמיכה
אהבת ישראל ממש.
מטורפת, פשוט מטורפת. אני חושב שיש יותר עוקבים מהודו מכל מקום אחר, אבל אתה בכל זאת.
For decades, India's diplomatic strength rested partly on the perception that it could still speak across geopolitical divides. That changed entirely on June 12, 2025, when the General Assembly voted again on a ceasefire resolution introduced by Spain. India abstained. In Asia, only India and Timor-Leste were not in the yes column. Among the BRICS partners, India stood alone in not supporting the resolution. Hours after the vote, Israel launched what became known as the 12-day war on Iran, striking its nuclear facilities and military sites. India's Ministry of External Affairs issued a careful statement. It did not include any condemnation of Israel's strikes. Days later, when the Shanghai Cooperation Organization issued a joint statement co-signed by Russia, China, Pakistan and Iran criticizing Israel's strikes, India distanced itself, saying its position had been articulated separately. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint military campaign against Iran. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in the initial Israeli strike. Tehran confirmed his death the following day. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel through which a fifth of the world's oil flows. 4 days later, on March 4, came the sinking of the Iranian frigate Iris Dena, while it was on its way home from India following a joint naval exercise. A US Navy submarine, USS Charlotte, fired 2 torpedoes at the vessel, sinking it. More than 100 were killed. New Delhi was almost mute. Indian opposition leaders and India's own former Navy chief pointed out that the ship had been India's guest. Here is where the paradox becomes visible. India has the second largest navy in the Indian Ocean region. It also operates a strategic port at Chabahar in Iran, built specifically for continental access, and is independent for both Pakistan and Chinese-controlled corridors. Although India engages in defense cooperation with Israel and the US, it also shares close historical ties with Iran. On paper, India was the country most uniquely positioned to mediate peace in the US-Israeli war in Iran. But when US and Iranian negotiators needed a venue for ceasefire talks in April 2026, Pakistan, a country India had fought 4 wars against, was chosen as the host. Islamabad had open channels with Washington, Tehran, Beijing and Gulf states simultaneously, giving it enough diplomatic flexibility to position itself as an intermediary once the conflict widened. It earned, in a single afternoon, more diplomatic capital than India had built up over decades.
I think the Pakistanis have been great.
Nearly half of India's crude oil imports move through the Strait of Hormuz, making instability in the Gulf not simply a foreign policy crisis, but also an economic vulnerability. And on May 10, 2026, the Indian Prime Minister addressed the nation. The man who had been celebrated in the Knesset just 2 months earlier now asked Indians to drive less, fly less, work from home, and buy less gold. 71 years after Bandung, the question facing India is no longer whether it is powerful. It is whether a country that once built its influence on strategic distance from rival blocs can preserve that flexibility after moving steadily closer to one side of a new geopolitical divide. India may be more globally visible than at any point in its modern history, but visibility and strategic freedom are not always the same thing.